There are moments in a sports season where a single piece of footage changes everything. Not because it reveals something nobody suspected, but because it confirmed something everybody already felt. The sideline exchange between Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark was one of those moments. It spread fast, it hit hard, and it forced the Indiana Fever organization into a position they clearly were not prepared for, having to answer publicly for something that was captured on camera and seen by millions of people before anyone could get ahead of it. And when the organization finally responded, they did not send the coach, they did not send the general manager. They sent Lexie Hull. And what followed that decision has quietly become one of the most revealing chapters of a season that has already been full of them. The fan community's reaction to Hull's interview was not subtle. It was immediate, it was widespread, and it was pointed in a direction that the organization clearly did not anticipate when they made the decision to put her in front of that camera. Understanding why requires going back to the footage itself, understanding what it showed, and understanding exactly how much was already in motion by the time Hull sat down to address it. The clips spread the way only certain clips spread, the kind that tap into something people have already been feeling and give it a visual anchor. Twitter was moving before most people had even finished watching it the first time. National platforms picked it up. Credible voices with real institutional weight in women's basketball were discussing it seriously. The footage of the sideline huddle between Stephanie White and Clark had, within hours, become the defining image of everything the fan base had been trying to articulate about this season. It was not just an argument on the sideline. For the thousands of people who watched it, it was confirmation. It was the moment where the tension that had been building under the surface of this team's season broke through into something visible and undeniable. The Indiana Fever organization understood this. You do not need inside knowledge of how professional sports franchises manage communications to recognize that a piece of footage generating that level of national attention, framed in a way that raises serious questions about how the franchise's most valuable and most watched player is being treated by her own coaching staff, represents an organizational crisis that demands a response. The front office had every incentive in the world to address this quickly, to shape the narrative before the narrative hardened into something they could not reshape. What they chose to do about that pressure is where things get complicated. Lexie Hull sat down for an interview and was asked directly about what happened in that huddle. Her answer was measured, calm, and deliberate. She described it as frustration. She said the team noticed opponents were targeting Clark defensively, that foul trouble mounted, that emotions ran high the way they do in competitive basketball, and that by the time the game moved on, the moment had already passed. "This is not something that carried on," she said. "This is not something talked about in our locker room." She acknowledged that Clark has a camera on her constantly, and that what the public saw was simply one visible moment in a landscape of competitive tension that plays out in women's basketball every single day. Her tone was reassuring, her framing was deliberate, and the fan community, watching every word, rejected almost all of it. Not because they dislike Lexie Hull. That needs to be said clearly and stated directly, because the frustration being expressed toward her interview is not frustration with her as a person or as a competitor. Hull has built genuine affection within the Clark fan community through something real, through the visible, physical, competitive loyalty she has shown on the court. The moments where she has stepped in to protect Clark in physical confrontations, the way she competes alongside her, the closeness that comes through in how they interact. These things have registered with the people watching, and they have generated real warmth toward Hull as a player and as a teammate. None of that is in question. None of that has changed. What changed is what she said about the footage. And the fan community's response reflects something specific and something important. They watched the same footage she is describing, and they do not believe her characterization matches what they saw. The reaction online was not random noise. It was organized, it was analytical, and it was unified around a specific point. People were not upset that Hull defended her team. Players defend their teams. That is normal and expected. What generated the wave of pushback was the perceived gap between what the camera captured and the interpretation Hull offered of what the camera captured. The footage shows what it shows. People watched it. People formed opinions about it. And when a player close to Clark appeared publicly to describe what they watched as routine competitive frustration, something that happens every day in women's basketball, something not worth worrying about, the fan community made a collective decision about which account to trust. They trusted their own eyes. That decision reflects something deeper than just disagreement with one player's take on one sideline moment. It reflects the accumulated weight of a season's worth of watching this organization manage information. Every controversy that has emerged around the Indiana Fever this season has been followed by a specific kind of organizational response, not from the people in positions of authority who made the decisions being questioned, but from the players closest to Clark who are positioned to provide cover for those decisions. The fan base has been watching that pattern develop for months. By the time Hull sat down for her interview, a significant portion of the people watching already had a framework for understanding what organizational purpose it was meant to serve. And that framework shaped everything about how her words were received. Think about the back injury disclosure controversy. That situation, where the way the organization communicated about Clark's injury created confusion, frustration, and ultimately the lowest attended game of Clark's era, generated real questions about the front office's decision-making around something as basic as keeping fans informed about their franchise players' health. Those questions deserved direct answers from the people who made the disclosure decisions. What the fan community got instead was Clark herself at the podium, managing the public fallout from a situation that the organization's own communications failures had created. Clark was put in the position of smoothing over damage that the front office generated through its own choices. Now, with sideline footage raising serious questions about the coaching staff's treatment of Clark, Hull was brought out to address the situation in terms that minimized the severity of what was documented. The structure is identical. Organizational decisions produce a public controversy. The people who made those decisions stay out of view. A player is sent to manage the public temperature. The front office's fingerprints are kept off the response. The players absorb the credibility risk of defending decisions they did not make. That is the pattern the fan community has identified, and it is the pattern they are rejecting. The question being asked most forcefully, the one that keeps surfacing in comment sections and fan forums and the analytical corners of Clark Twitter, where the most attentive observers are processing this season, is devastatingly simple. Where is the front office? Where are the coaches? When does Stephanie White sit down with journalists and answer real questions about what happened in that huddle and what it reflects about the team's environment? When does the general manager address the competitive situation this franchise is in and take direct responsibility for the organizational decisions that produced it? When do the people whose choices are generating these controversies stand in front of cameras and answer for those choices themselves, in settings where journalists can push back and follow up and refuse to accept answers that do not match the documented record? That conversation has not happened. It did not happen after the disclosure controversy. It did not happen after the coaching decision patterns that have limited Clark's minutes in critical moments became a public discussion. It is not happening now in the aftermath of the sideline footage. The organizational leadership of the Indiana Fever has been conspicuously, consistently absent from the accountability conversations that their own decisions have made necessary. And the fan community has noticed with the kind of precise, sustained attention that only comes from people who have significant personal stakes in what they are watching. In most professional sports franchises, where an organizational culture is functioning with any degree of health, this is not how significant public controversies get handled. A head coach who is at the center of a public controversy about how she is treating her franchise player does not send a teammate to manage the fallout. She addresses it herself. A general manager whose front office decisions have generated serious questions about organizational competence does not let those questions circulate unanswered while players are deployed to redirect the narrative. They answer the questions. They sit in front of journalists. They accept the friction of genuine accountability rather than routing every difficult conversation through player voices that can be positioned more carefully and controlled more completely than a genuine press conference can be. The Indiana Fever has operated differently, and the fan community has drawn conclusions from that difference. Hull also made a specific argument about competitiveness, about the team's record relative to the margins within individual games. And that argument landed even worse with the people paying closest attention to the numbers. The framing was recognizable. The Fever have been competitive. Multiple games have come down to a few possessions. The record does not fully reflect how close the team has been to winning. It is the kind of framing that sounds reasonable in the abstract and collapses the moment you apply it to specific numbers. The Indiana Fever are 4-4. That is the number. That is the scoreboard reality that exists independent of how individual losses are characterized. A franchise built around the most watched player in women's basketball history, with the roster investment, that number of eyeballs, and that level of national attention generates, should not be a 4-4 team at any point in its season. It should not be losing to expansion franchises. It should not be in a situation where its franchise player, the reason the cameras are there, the reason the tickets sell, the reason national platforms are dedicating coverage to this team, is being limited to 22 minutes in games that fall apart without her. The gap between what this organization's talent level and financial investment should produce and what the standings currently show is not a gap that can be explained away by talking about how close some of the losses were. Fans who purchased tickets, who invested financially and emotionally in this franchise, who have been tracking every game and every box score with the attention level of people who genuinely care about outcomes, they are not grading this team on a curve. They are not evaluating it by how it interestingly loses. They are evaluating it by whether it wins. And the 4-4 record answers that question with a clarity that no framing about competitive margins can soften. When Hull offered the close game argument, she was asking the fan base to look at the record through the lens that makes the record seem less alarming than it is. The fan base declined. They looked at the record through the lens of what this team is supposed to be and what the scoreboard says it currently is. Those two things do not match, and no player interview, however warmly received under other circumstances, was going to change what the numbers say. There is a structural problem underneath all of this that goes beyond any single interview or any single controversy. The Indiana Fever have been using the genuine affection the fan community has for certain players as an organizational communications asset. It is not subtle once you see it. Hull's closeness to Clark is real. The fan community values it because they believe it reflects genuine loyalty and genuine care for someone they have invested heavily in. That closeness is exactly what makes her voice useful as an organizational communications tool in moments of controversy. A player who the fan base trusts because of her visible loyalty to Clark is precisely the player whose words will carry the most weight when the organization needs something minimized or reframed. Deploy that voice effectively, and you get the closest thing to Clark herself reassuring fans that everything is fine. Except the fan community sees it now. They see the deployment. They see the timing. They see the framing. They see the specific organizational purpose the interview was designed to serve. And because they see it, it is not working. What was meant to calm the temperature has instead raised it. What was meant to restore trust has instead deepened the skepticism. The organizational communication strategy that is supposed to be managing this franchise's relationship with its fan base is producing the opposite of what it is designed to produce. Every deployment generates its own controversy. Every carefully managed appearance creates a new wave of analysis about why it was deployed and what it was designed to accomplish. The machine is visible, and a visible machine is an ineffective machine. The buddy-buddy footage that circulated earlier this season to establish a narrative of team cohesion and positive chemistry was followed within days by the sideline footage that became the story of the week. The blocking campaigns the front office ran on social media when critical voices started gaining attention did not suppress the criticism. They became their own news cycle, with fans documenting the blocking and treating it as evidence of exactly the kind of organizational behavior they were already criticizing. The player appearances designed to put fires out have been starting new ones. The pattern has become so consistent that the fan community can now anticipate the cycle before it completes. Controversy emerges, player appears to manage it, fan base dissects the deployment, new layer of controversy develops around the deployment itself, the front office stays out of view throughout. Repeat. This cycle is not sustainable. The fan community that is most engaged with this franchise, the people who watch every game, who track every box score, who have the kind of emotional investment that drives ticket sales and merchandise revenue, and the sustained national attention that the WNBA has been desperately seeking for decades, is not becoming less attentive as the season continues. It is becoming more attentive. It is becoming more organized. It is developing more sophisticated analytical frameworks for evaluating the organizational behavior it is observing. Every iteration of the same strategy lands with diminishing effect on a fan base that has already seen the previous iterations and drawn conclusions from them. The credibility that organizational communications are supposed to be building through these player appearances is not accumulating. It is eroding. Each appearance that the fan community reads as organizational damage control rather than genuine player expression makes the next appearance harder to receive as genuine. The well is getting shallower, and the Indiana Fever's ownership and front office need to decide with some urgency whether this pattern continues or whether something fundamentally different is going to be tried. Lexie Hull should not be carrying this. That is the honest conclusion that the fan community's response points toward, even when that response is expressed as criticism of her interview. She is a basketball player. Her job is to compete, to protect her teammates, to contribute to winning. She has done those things. She has done them visibly and well in the moments that have mattered. She is not a communications director. She is not an organizational spokesperson. She is not the appropriate party to be answering questions about coaching decisions and organizational accountability on behalf of a front office that is not stepping forward to answer those questions itself. The coaching staff made the decisions that are being questioned. The coaching staff should be addressing those questions directly, in settings where journalists can ask real follow-up questions, where the answers have to match the documented record, where the accountability conversation happens in real time rather through managed appearances calibrated to deliver a specific message. Stephanie White should be talking about that sideline exchange herself. The general manager should be addressing the competitive situation this franchise is in and taking ownership of the organizational choices that produced it. The people in positions of authority need to stand in front of the accountability that their authority generates. Until that happens, nothing changes. Every player interview that addresses an organizational controversy will be processed by the fan community through the accumulated weight of everything that preceded it. Every careful framing will be identified and evaluated as framing. Every deployment of a trusted player voice will be recognized as a deployment. The trust deficit between this franchise and its most engaged supporters has reached a level where organizational communication strategies are not just failing, they are actively making things worse. The people the Indiana Fever most need to reach are the people most capable of seeing through the strategies being used to reach them. There is only one thing that actually addresses a trust deficit of this magnitude. Not carefully managed player appearances, not blocking campaigns, not buddy-buddy footage strategically circulated before a controversy breaks. Genuine accountability. The actual decision-makers answering for the actual decisions in front of actual journalists asking real questions in an environment where the friction of genuine scrutiny cannot be avoided or routed around. That is what the situation demands. That is what the fan community is asking for, and that is precisely what the Indiana Fever organization has been most unwilling to provide. The cameras are still rolling, the box scores are still being posted, the attendance figures are still being recorded. Everything this season has been is documented, and the gap between what that documentation shows and what the organizational communications have been claiming about it is the source of everything the fan community is expressing right now. Close it honestly or watch it widen.